Welcome to today's episode of the Normalized Surrogacy podcast by Surrogacy Mentor. I'm your host, Carey Flamer-Powell, experienced gestational surrogate, surrogacy agency founder, and owner of Surrogacy Mentor, where our aim is to help surrogates match with reputable surrogacy agencies for a safe, ethical, and enjoyable surrogacy journey. Today, I am happy to welcome our very special guest, parent via surrogacy and investigative reporter, Ginanne Brownell. Welcome, Ginanne.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. I'm so excited to talk to you today about our topic, which is the passage of the Michigan Family Protection Act, which is a huge positive change in the surrogacy community here in the USA. But before we dive in, I do want to share a little bit about Ginanne. Ginanne Brownell is an award-winning journalist and author of Elusive Mommyhood, an investigative reporter's personal journey into IVF and surrogacy. Blending memoir with investigative reporting, the book explores the emotional, ethical, and legal complexities of assisted reproduction, drawing from Ginanne's own surrogacy experience and her advocacy work in passing the Michigan Family Protection Act. So again, welcome. Super excited to talk about this topic. It was such a surprising and welcome positive change that Michigan now has legal surrogacy. But before we talk about that specifically, why don't you share with those listening and watching your personal experience with surrogacy?
Right. So I'm originally from Michigan, but I live in London in the UK. And I was told, I don't remember what age I was at this point, that I had unexplained infertility. I'd gone through I'd done all the things, making sure that, I went through temporary menopause. They flushed my fallopian tubes. They did everything. We did, fresh transfers. We did frozen transfers and nothing ever worked. And so after about 2.5, 3 years of this, my gynecologist said to me, I think we need to accept that you have unexplained infertility. And at that point, I had 5 frozen eggs and I had 2 or 3 frozen embryos. And so we decided to sort of take the surrogacy route. And I luckily had some dear friends, a gay Israeli couple who were about 13 months ahead of me on their surrogacy journey in Oregon. And so they were really helpful to be able to talk to about sort of their journey and what the process was, because I didn't know anybody who'd done surrogacy before. And so it was very incredibly helpful. And so we found an agency, we signed on, we found a wonderful surrogate based in Illinois, and we wanted to do it in Michigan, but we couldn't, obviously, because at that point it was still compensated surrogacy and contract surrogacy were felonies in Michigan. So we found a surrogate in Illinois, and she didn't get pregnant the first time with the frozen eggs. She got pregnant the second time with our frozen embryos, but unfortunately she had a miscarriage. And then we had to go the donor conceived route. And so we had one egg donor who we worked with, who on paper looked great. She was amazing. It was an open donation. Unfortunately, they did genetic testing and those embryos all had genetic anomalies. So we found another egg donor, and we luckily finally were able to achieve a pregnancy or have embryos that were fine, achieve a pregnancy with Julie. And my twins were born, boy and girl twins were born in 2018. So they're now 7 years old.
That's amazing. I love that you have such a personal connection to surrogacy, obviously. So let's talk about the Michigan Family Protection Act. So for those that may not have any idea what we're talking about, what's the 30-second history on surrogacy in Michigan before the Michigan Family Protection Act?
So I will try to keep it brief, but Michigan has a very pivotal history in the world of global surrogacy. So Michigan was the first place in the world where a compensated surrogacy contract was signed in 1976 by a man by the name of Noel Keene. And he did a lot of contracts after that, including, of course, the infamous Baby M case in the mid-'80s in New Jersey. He also was the person that created a surrogacy contract for a different family in New Jersey, which was the first gestational surrogacy in the world. And that child was born, Jill Brandt, who I interviewed for my book. Jill was born in Ypsilanti, Michigan in 1986. And Michigan was also the first place in the world because of Jill's birth, where a judge ruled that the intended parents and not the surrogate's name should go on the birth certificate. So that was kind of what was happening in Michigan. But then all of a sudden, obviously, the Baby M case happened and the state of Michigan, got very concerned because at that point, surrogacy was very new. It was sort of uncharted territory. And so they decided to create this 1988 Surrogate Parenting Act, which kind of just ended surrogacy completely, or not completely, but ended surrogacy contracts in the state of Michigan. And so it just kind of slammed the door on that. There was a loophole in that law which allowed for non-compensated surrogacy. But the problem was, as you know, this is, a huge issue, is that, these a lot of people who've done surrogacy, who've acted as surrogates in Michigan, they haven't gone through all the processes that one should go through. A lot of people who maybe were turned down by other agencies popped up on sort of, Michigan surrogacy sites saying, I can be your surrogate. And since there were no contracts, it also meant that you sort of had to entrust the person that you were working with. And also, because the contracts were not allowed, it also meant that different judges in different parts of the state would rule differently. So, for example, if you lived in a sort of more liberal area, like let's say suburban Detroit, chances are you would probably get a pre-birth order before your child was born. But, if you lived in the west side of the state, which is more conservative, there were judges who actually were not signing pre-birth orders. And there was a case that made national news a few years ago of a couple called Tammy Myers, and I forget her husband's, Jordan, and they had twins, but the judge did not give them a pre-birth order. And so they had to go through an adoption process of their twins. So anyway, that's sort of the landscape of why that law happened and sort of what that looked like until the passing of the Michigan Family Protection Act.
Right. And, for those of us on the professional side, Michigan was always what we call a red light state, meaning absolutely cannot do surrogacy there. It's dangerous. There's, it's criminalized, and it's don't go there, basically. And so we have not, as professionals, been able to work with surrogates. Those who have worked with surrogates in Michigan, it's been very much hush hush. And like you said, it had to be a lot of trust between the parties, because the surrogate really had all the power to make whatever decision she wanted to. And for those that don't know what the Baby M case was, we won't go over the details here, but Google the Baby M case and why that was such a critical case that really changed a lot of things in Michigan. So this is, I think it's 38 years of history in Michigan being this way for surrogacy, but now we have the Michigan Family Protection Act. So what is the Michigan Family Protection Act, and what's the effect on surrogacy now?
So the Michigan Family Protection Act, which was signed into law on April 1st of last year and came into effect last week, and I won't bore you with why that's the case, but it has to do with sort of weird Michigan legislative laws. What that law does is it now allows for both compensated surrogacy and contracts. It also has, what we're equally as proud of, is something called a parentage part of the law as well. So it means that any child born through assisted reproduction in the state of Michigan will know from birth who their parents are, that they'll be legally tied to their parents. And that is especially important for same-sex couples. Like, for example, a lesbian couple where the genetic parent obviously is on the birth certificate, but the non-genetic parent isn't. And so they have to go through this complicated second parent adoption. What that now means is that they won't have to do that. That, pretty much before they leave the hospital, they get the VAP, voluntary active parentage, and, both names are on the birth certificate and there's no question. So we're very much proud of that as well. But essentially what it means is that now you can have contracts for surrogacy. You can have surrogates who are in state. You can have Michigan families being able to gain pre-birth orders before their children are born. There's no question that they will receive those. And so it just kind of, it opens up the landscape. And it's really, really exciting because, we've seen so many heartbreaking stories in the state of people who, are just desperate to have kids and they couldn't go out of state for whatever reason. And so either they had to work with somebody who was a non-compensated surrogate, or they just kind of had to, some people, unfortunately, child is not by choice in some of these situations. And so it's a huge, huge law. And the great part, we're also really proud because Michigan Family Protection Act, Michigan Fertility Alliance, of which I'm the communications and research director. We worked with some amazing national coalitions like GLAAD, the National Women's Law Center, the Center for Reproductive Rights, to write this law and to make sure that it really was, airtight, that it really represented the surrogates, the intended parents, and the children. And really, we wanted to focus so much on the children as to make sure that they were really looked at in this as well. And so we really think that it's in many ways best practice law in surrogacy. And we're just really proud after almost 4 years of working on it that it's finally come into effect.
Well, it's really exciting because it takes, like I said, what was a red light state. So we have like green, yellow, and red, right? Like green is yay, everything's great. You can do surrogacy there, no problem. Yellow is be careful. There's some gray area. And then red is like absolutely do not work in these states, right? And it took Michigan from red all the way to green, to where it's not only, we're not only able to do surrogacy there now, but it's actually something we can look at as, like you said, a framework for other states who maybe want to either enact laws or statutes or a process that doesn't exist. Because a lot of states don't actually have any laws on the books whatsoever. They just have statutes and ways that things are done, and, you know, precedents set by certain jurisdictions or judges, but there's no actual law. And so Michigan went from being stay away to, wow, actually look at what they did there and maybe use it to model some other states' process on.
Well, and the other one of the things that was really cool about working on the law, and I don't want to sort of like become a policy wonk here, but there was, the Uniform Parentage Act, which sort of is, model legislation on lots of things around parentage, including around surrogacy and assisted reproduction. And the reporter on the legal reporter on that law or on the Parentage Act is a woman by the name of Courtney Joslin, who's based in California. And Courtney worked with us on our bill. So like we got the sort of best of the best, the gold standard of people working on this bill. And that was really exciting for us too, because we thought like, gosh, we've really got the people who know, I mean, these are the minds, the legal minds who know this stuff inside and out. And it was just really exciting to know that, these were people who'd been working on this for years and they were helping us set up this law. So we're really proud of that.
So you used to live in Michigan, and were you working on this the whole time while living in the UK?
Living in the UK, yeah. So I'll tell you sort of how it kind of came about, how I kind of
Yeah.
came to be involved in this. So yes, I am from Michigan originally. My mom was living in Michigan up until a few years ago. I spend every summer in Michigan. I'm a registered voter in Michigan. I'm a Michigan girl. And so when I started working on this book in 2020, I came across a woman by the name of Stephanie Jones, who had founded the Michigan Fertility Alliance. And she had a couple of near fatal ectopic pregnancies. And so she decided to found the Michigan Fertility Alliance because she was going to have to, have a second child via surrogacy. And so I interviewed her for my book, and we just like got along like a house on fire. And, we just started chatting, and she didn't know a lot of the sort of national people on this because I'd been doing research on this. And, she was sort of telling me the lay of the land in Michigan. And so it was sort of, we joke sometimes that if we were one person, we'd be like a genius. Like we have the same brain, but like different bodies. And so over time, she just said to me, would you, want to come on board and do this work with me? And so we just kind of put our heads down, and like, because of the people that I'd interviewed for the book, we'd reached out to them, made these connections, and sort of also after the elections in 2022, in Michigan, we had the resolution, Prop 3 was what it was called, and it sort of enshrined reproductive health care and abortion rights into the Constitution of Michigan. So we were reached out by the Center of Reproductive Rights, who were contacts of mine, and they said, listen, things are looking good in Michigan right now. You guys have just passed this amendment. You've got, for the first time in 40 years, you have a legislature which is, Democratic, plus you have a Democratic governor, Governor Whitmer. Maybe the time is right to do this. And so we just started working with these national organizations, and they just helped us craft this law. And we were, it was an amazing experience, because I never thought that I would work on something like this. And it's just to get into the nitty gritty of grassroots advocacy, and also in terms of like working on state legislation, it is a whole hayride of craziness.
Well, that's really neat that you were able to be so involved with something that was obviously close to your heart, but from the whole other country. I mean, we have a hard enough time sometimes with people that live here finding the time and the energy and the effort to put forth in their home state. So I think it's really kind of amazing that you were able to do that while being in a completely different time zone, and, your surrogacy is already behind you and all of that. So that's really great.
Well, it was great though, actually, in a way, because I would sort of start my day and kind of get through a lot of stuff in my day, because I'm still a working journalist. And then by the time sort of Stephanie got up, I'd be able to kind of brief her on the work that I did. And then she'd be working into the night on her time. So we kind of had like longer days than maybe most people. So it kind of worked out, really well. But there were definitely times like I would have to get on at like midnight to like speak with like, a state senator or something. And I'd be like, bleary eyed trying to, but it was, yeah, it was I wouldn't say it was the ideal way, but it was definitely the way we had to do it. And so we got it done.
It's incredible. And I've done a little bit of legislative advocacy work when I had my agency in Oregon. And you're right, it's a lot. It's a whole other world. And there's so many moving parts and so many things you don't even think about that are involved. And the fact that you guys and when I say you guys, I mean everyone involved in this 4-year process, were able to get this done is incredible. It's a feat for sure, and one that I think surrogacy is better off for in general, but especially, anytime we can further the rights of parents and surrogates and create a process that's ethical and transparent and ultimately in service of families and the child, that to me is a win. And so, what would you say to women who are listening, who are, living in Michigan, that maybe, previously have been told you can't be a surrogate. Sorry, we can't work with you. Who maybe are a little bit nervous and don't quite, trust that everything they've been told for the last few years is actually not correct anymore. What would you say to them?
Well, I would say, first of all, go to the Michigan Fertility Alliance website. We've got tons of information on there. One of the things that, I mean, even though it was frustrating in a way that it took so long from when the law was signed to when it actually came into effect, that gave us a year to actually do lots of training. So we trained over, I think, 500 lawyers, judges, hospital administrators, nurses, all these people who are involved in the process. And so I think we do have some webinars floating out there as well. If people really want to deep dive, we've got all that information and all the details. And we also feel really, we've made some great connections with all these people who are sort of looking into working in the state of Michigan, or who already are in the state of Michigan, who we've kind of educated up on this bill. And so they have a good, I think, understanding of all the ins and outs of it. And so, that was also something, a feather in our cap that we hadn't really thought about after we passed the bill. And all of a sudden we're like, oh, we actually need to kind of now put this into effect. So yeah, I would say, have a look on our website, talk to, agencies that are either in state or out of state if you're interested in working with them, and see if they've sort of been trained up on all this stuff. And, that people can always reach out to us and we can point them in some directions of places to go as well.
I love that. Well, I think, thank you for your contribution to all of this. It's incredible. And I'm so excited, not only as a former surrogate, but as a professional in this industry, that we have, again, yet another wonderful path to surrogacy in another state that wasn't previously available to us. So, any parting words for parents or surrogates who, maybe in or out of Michigan, that are thinking about starting this journey?
Well, I mean, one of the things that, I don't know if it's directly related to that question, but one of the things that, I'm really keen to sort of talk about in the book is, I think that there are many things within the surrogacy space that we need to change the narrative around. I think, there's a lot of narratives that have been incorrect over the years around surrogates, but also about sort of children born through surrogacy. And that's something that I'm really becoming quite active on right now, because as we know, I mean, there aren't great numbers, but I'm sort of making the general estimate that around the globe, there are probably hundreds of thousands of children at this point over the years who've been born through surrogacy. And granted, the majority of them are still probably under 18. But they have voices, and they have, and so I think that, oftentimes you hear people make all these comments against surrogacy, and it's like, but what about the children? And there's an amazing longitudinal report that came out of the University of Cambridge. I'm sure you're probably aware of it, that looked at sort of 40 children born through surrogacy. And it was so amazing because, people are always saying, oh, children are going to feel this way and they're going to feel that way. And actually, this report came out and said, no, actually, children born through surrogacy, at the end of the day, they kind of don't care. Like, they're fine. Either the kids are like, here's a weird, quirky way, here's an icebreaker at a party. This was how I was born. Or
Right.
kids kind of say, who cares how I was born? I'm here and that's what matters. And I think I'm trying to get that narrative changed a little bit, because I think it's so important to ask, how do kids feel about it? And actually, most of them are just like, who cares? It's more interesting, like what my forehand is like, or, like what my career goals are, like how my book report at school. And so that for
Right.
me is important to kind of try and change that conversation.
I agree. As obviously someone who's super involved in surrogacy as a former surrogate, but also as a mom to a daughter born via sperm donation, the same thing is true for donor conceived people. It's to them, it's just part of their story. It's not who they are. And I think it's all about how we share information about how they came to be. It's all about how we frame it as parents. And I think that the more transparent and the more open we are in general, whether it's donor conception, surrogacy, the better off all parties are, and especially the children.
Mhm.
So I'm
And one more thing I was going to mention, and this is sort of a plug for just to give you a little bit of an overview that, just because the MFPA passed doesn't mean that our work in Michigan isn't done. But also, we 2 months ago started with some other advocates a national coalition called State Strong. And our
Mhm.
national coalition is helping advocates on the ground in all 50 states who are working on legislation in regards to assisted reproduction, surrogacy. As we know, unfortunately, there's a lot of bad things that have been happening in the fertility healthcare space. And so our goal and our role is to try and help people. So, there are some states that maybe only have one person who's advocating on something. And so we're trying to give them the messaging. We're trying to give them the support of, some good bills that they can look at. And so if anybody out there is sort of, working on some of this grassroots stuff in their state and they feel that they need help, we are around. That's part of what we've decided to form our organization to kind of really work on these things, because as we know, it's all happening in individual states right now. And we need to kind of have good legislation out there because there's a lot of bad stuff that we've been seeing.
Is there a website for that?
It is statestrong.org. Yep. We just put our website up last week.
Well, I'm excited about that, and I'm actually going to check that out because where I'm currently based is Arizona, and we have some work to do here. So I definitely am interested in looking into that. So, well, I'm excited to share the link for that as well as the link for your book and information about Michigan Fertility Alliance, all of the things in this episode so people can learn more. So thank you so much for your time and for all that you've done to further surrogacy.
Well, thank you so much for letting me come on and chat about my passion project. I really appreciate it. So thank you.
Absolutely. And that brings us to the end of this episode of the Normalized Surrogacy podcast by Surrogacy Mentor. I again want to thank my very special guest, Ginanne Brownell, for joining me for this chat today. You can learn more about Ginanne via the links in this podcast. And be sure to check us out online at surrogacymentor.com. If you're interested in knowing whether surrogacy is right for you, take the easy 2-minute quiz on our website. Also learn more about our intended parent mentoring at modernparentmentor.com. Subscribe to this podcast to learn more about gestational surrogacy and how to have a safe, ethical, and enjoyable surrogacy journey. Talk to you next time.